You are listening to the Rainbow Rock Show on WAYO LP Rochester.
But we've got a great interview right now.
Yes. Oh, we do. Let's hit it, man. Let's just get right into it.
Hi, Dan. Cody. Yay!
Welcome.
Dan Cody. He's a gentleman that wrote a large amount of words, 65,629 words, according to my Microsoft Word count. And he wrote a master's degree thesis called Rochester Coughed, the 1918 Influenza Epidemic in Rochester, New York. Dan or Daniel, which do you prefer?
Dan.
Okay. Dan, welcome to Rainbow Rock on behalf of myself, Michael, and Brian. I believe I came across this originally by Gary Craig from the DNC, and there was one other person that mentioned you, like during the whole COVID situation, about our prior history. Just one of the ground rules that we have agreed to with the city of Rochester, since they were so kind, because you do work for the city of Rochester at the library. Do you care to? What is your position within the library system?
I am a library assistant in the local history and genealogy department.
Correct. Okay. So one of the things that we did agree to with the city is that we would not get into anything that was political about COVID, about what's happening in politics today. And guess what? You don't need to, because there's so much here. I mean, it blew me. It's taken me a month to kind of like absorb the information and go over it a couple of times. What possessed you to write this amazing work?
Well, I was looking for a subject to write a master's thesis on. And I knew I had to stay local to get primary documents to write a master's thesis. So in my family, my grandmother's sister died during that time. And we always thought that she died of the influenza. Well, then we found out that she really didn't. But it just got my interest, is that something like so terrible nobody knew about. And then I went and looked for some other sources, and we found out, we being myself and my mentor at SUNY Brockport, Dr. Bruce Leslie, we found out that there was no definitive piece of work on the 1918 influenza epidemic. So we decided we were going to give it a try. And it took me about 7 months to do the research, and then about 3 or 4 months to do the writing. So it was a fascinating process.
I'm like reading this thing, and like there's a movie script in it. It's just the picturing of what Rochester was like and the challenges and the opportunities at the same time. Your document, one of the things that when you read this, we will put up the link for the public up on our website and also our Facebook, and about why this is so important. Because in order to understand where we are, we need to understand where we have been. And I learned that myself as an AIDS activist in the 80s and the 90s, that so much of what happened during that period of time, it was difficult. It just how do we deal with these issues that we were dealing with at that time? That was my pandemic, my epidemic that I lived and breathed every day when I lived in New York City. And then when I read through your master's piece, I felt like I was there. Literally, there's even humor in it. How do you have humor in an epidemic? But some of I guess maybe because of the context of what I'm thinking, like what happened when Rochester decided to close the bars in 1918. Well, if you read this piece, you'll find out they got on the trolleys and they went to Brighton. I mean, and realizing how influenza was dealt with and how much of a threat it was. Can you walk people through what your experience of when you look back and reading and having written this and defending it as a piece? If you were depicting a movie and you had some words to say, other than the ones you wrote, 65,000, What would be the thing that was the most important thing for people to have learned from your work?
Probably the number one takeaway from my work was that it was regular people and a huge army of volunteers that fought influenza in Rochester in 1918. There wasn't really any specific dedicated city response to it. It was basically volunteers that flocked to the Red Cross, and the Red Cross, with the support of the city acting health officer, Dr. Joseph Roby. What they did then was they went out and implemented the suggestions that Dr. Roby made and fought influenza the best they could. But you have to remember too during this is 1918. The world is in a world war, the worst war that we've ever seen mankind up to that time. So that when influenza did hit, the thought was, well, our boys are dying in France. We can put up with a little bit of flu. Well, it wasn't a little bit of flu. It was this very, very deadly variant of the natural occurring influenza virus, but it killed so quickly so that when we had to deal with it, we were dealing with something we had never dealt with before. As we all know today, influenza is a virus. Back in 1918, they did not identify it as a virus because the electron microscope hadn't been invented yet because they couldn't see it.
Right.
So they were fighting an unknown, invisible enemy. At the same time, they were fighting a war 3,000 miles away.
One of the things that you said in your paper was there was also a sense of paranoia and fear that had stricken the community, and that some had even thought that this was a German conspiracy. Can you elaborate on that?
There was some articles, especially in East Coast newspapers, about the influenza being deposited on American shores by crews coming off of German U-boats. The influenza, as it devastated the United States, actually started on the East Coast in Camp Devon, which was a processing point for soldiers to go overseas. And then the paranoia spread. The miracle drug at the time was aspirin, developed by the Bayer Company. And the Bayer Company is a German company. And of course, anything that was associated with the enemy was going to be something that would present a threat. And people were just afraid of the unknown. They'd close their doors to neighbors. They'd close their doors to family members that didn't live in the same house because the influenza came and it killed so quickly.
Now, was this something that hit the community real fast, or was it a gradual pickup? How did that happen in Rochester?
Well, actually, it's interesting is that Dr. Roby knew that it was coming. They realized very quickly by reading newspapers that the influenza was moving west from the East Coast following the railroad line, which was mass transportation for the day, 1918. So they kind of knew it was coming, but when it came very quickly in the last week of September. So by the first, October 5th, there were 100 confirmed cases in Rochester, and just 3 days later, there were 800 confirmed cases.
Wow!
And this is interesting. This is interesting too because influenza in 1918 was not a reportable disease. So there were some people that got sick prior to this and died prior to this. Those numbers aren't included in influenza because they thought that they died of pneumonia, which was something very, very similar.
I think one of the things that I found interesting, when you look back historically, that there were 5 different railroad companies in Rochester, according, if I read that correctly in your work. And so if you have 5 different railroad companies and you're bringing, obviously, troops and soldiers that are going back and forth from Buffalo, Chicago, Syracuse, Rochester must have become like a hotbed.
It was. Now, you have to remember, again, I'm going to point out this was 1918. We didn't have the tractor-trailer trucks that move all our products today. So everything that came into the city was brought in by rail. And Rochester, just because of geographically where it's located, it was a transportation hub because it was easier to build railroad lines through Western New York, especially along the south shore of Lake Ontario, than to go over the Appalachian Mountains. So they would do is they would follow our present day thruway. And if you think about it, when you're driving on the thruway let's say to Albany, you're on the thruway. Right next to it is the railroad tracks, and right next to it is the canal. So you have three major forms of transportation, all using the same geographic flat land.
Now, you said that the doctors saw it coming. What steps did they take to prepare the community prior to it really coming to town? They really couldn't do much because there was really no authority. Dr. Roby didn't have any enforcement authority. What he did was he made suggestions, and then the city commissioner of safety, Mr. Hamilton, was the one that could do the enforcements. But at the same time, you have to remember, again, this is 1918, there was no social safety nets in place. So we had to keep the community, we had to keep the economy going, because if you didn't go to work, you weren't getting paid, and there was no unemployment insurance at the time. There was no Social Security at the time. So if you weren't working, you weren't bringing an income in. And if you weren't bringing income in, there was a good chance you were going to lose your lodgings, or you weren't going to eat that time. And that became a problem when influenza grabbed Rochester.
I think communication would have been a problem too, because you don't have the communication would be slow. I would think, letting people know what's happening, a lot slower back then.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the ways that Dr. Roby did fight influenza was through a massive campaign of education. He put out all of these posters, and everywhere and anywhere that people would gather. And it were these posters that had the do's and the don'ts of what to do in order to protect yourself from the influenza. And what he also did too, much to his credit, is he realized that Rochester was a destination city, meaning that people came here to get a good job. And they came here from all over the world. So we had a very large immigrant population. So what he did was he printed these posters in these native languages of our ethnic communities so that he could educate them as well.
When it comes to, one of the things I read in your paper was how it affected disparate communities. So like the Italian community was hit really, really hard. The Germans, not so much. What was the makeup in your understanding of the communities that were most affected, either in death and or in illness? And what did you think was, when you look back and the study that when you went through the stuff, what was the cause of that other than influenza? In other words, housing, things like that.
That's it. I couldn't avoid making a statistical analysis of it, especially in the conclusion for it. During everything else, I was trying to put a human face on the tragedy of 1918 influenza. But in the conclusion, when you do the analysis, you did find that the Italian community was the hardest hit. They were 13% of all of the deaths. And that is in large part because the Italians were the last great wave of immigrants coming into Rochester. So immigrants hit the shores with like no money in their pockets. They're going to find some relative that lives somewhere, and they're going to all live together until the new arrivals can get established. So in these communities, especially where the Italian community was at the time, like over by the public market, the numbered streets, what I did was I went and I looked at the address of everyone who died. I noted their names, their ages, and their address to see if one neighborhood was affected worse. And it was the Italian neighborhood, because it was very common for 3 or 4 families to live in one house at a time until they got established on their own. But it only took one of those people to be sick, to come home, to cough or sneeze, and infect everybody in the house.
One of the things that you raised was that a nurse, if they would call upon the house, thought they were dealing with one person, but in fact, they were dealing with 10. And so if they were bringing food for one, which was great to learn, I learned a lot about the Mechanics Institute and the outreach that they did. There was like over 12,000 meals that were provided. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what that was like as far as the community outreach and helping people, but also what it must have been like for a nurse or a doctor to have to attend to a house and they're unprepared?
the helpers that were going out into the community, they were prepared. Dr. Roby insisted that all Red Cross workers wear gauze masks, and it was unique because people were so afraid that they shuttered their doors, and someone would knock on the door, they wouldn't answer it. But if someone knocked on the door and you peeked out the door and you saw someone in a Red Cross uniform, and they all tried to wear uniforms, at least one of the people going to the door, and they had their mask on, you knew that those people were there to help you, and you knew that they were not sick, because Dr. Roby wouldn't let any sick relief workers go out into the community. So when they would come into the house, like you said, they would think, well, Mr. Smith didn't go to work, he was sick. Well, his whole family was sick. And the problem would be, especially with people that were in the lower economic strata, is that this is the days, believe it or not, before there was a Wegmans everywhere. There were no refrigerators. So people would buy their food on the way home. The worker would buy the food for the family on the way home from work. They'd prepare it, eat it, and then start the whole thing all over again the next day. You were lucky if you had an icebox. So if that person who was going out into the world and working and getting the money and getting the food, now he is sick and cannot get out of bed, there's no food coming into the house. So now you had families that had no source of food, and because of the fear and paranoia that was gripping the city, there was no action to come and help until the Red Cross acknowledged this and then started to reach out in an amazing way out into the community.
So was the public market actually a hotbed of activity for spreading it? Because I know the numbered streets are right located by that.
There was no really single spot that my research found that was the source. A great source of spreading was the streetcars, because the streetcars were very, very long and narrow. So you were sitting almost knee to knee with the person across from you. So if someone was sick and coughed, very easily you would get it. Remember, this was happening in the fall of 1918. It's getting cold. People, the passengers would close the windows. The streetcar companies knew that this was an issue, but they had to keep the streetcars running because the workers had to keep going to work for a number of reasons. One, to make money to feed their families, take care of their families. And two, we had a war going on, and we were part of the war munitions issue. We were making materials for the war effort, especially after the United States got into the war the previous year. So what the streetcar companies did was they took some of the windows out of the streetcars so people couldn't close them, so they would keep the air moving. So they were very, very, very adaptable, very smart.
Yeah, wow, that's something else.
So here we have, it's the fall. What was the time frame of the pandemic in Rochester as far as, like, I hate to use the number of people that are dying and getting sick. In other words, was that a backdraft of a fire? So you have people that there is no social safety net. How did was there an asylum in Rochester? How did the hospitals deal with, and what were the hospitals like back then?
That's another interesting social point, is that hospitals were seen as two things. One is just the rich people went there, and you went there to die. So you didn't go to the hospitals.
Wow.
So people tried to stay home and take care of each other. But then Dr. Roby came out in his campaign of education and saying, no, you should send the sick people to the hospital, because what it was doing, it was withdrawing the sick people from the general population. We were isolating them. We were quarantining them in the hospitals. But the hospitals at the time were not the nice places that they are today. This was the day of hospitals when there were wards. And so there were these big rooms with lots and lots of beds in them. So at first, they tried to keep the beds apart. But then as more and more people got sick and went to the hospital, space became a premium. So they started hanging sheets between the beds to try to keep the coughs and the sneezes isolated. But then what happened is just like here in COVID in 2021, our health system was overrun. We had to open emergency, they call them auxiliary hospitals. There was one at the Lewis Street settlement one at the Baden Street settlement. They reopened the Children's Convalescent Home down on Beach Avenue in Charlotte. That kind of took care of mostly of the soldiers that were at the Rochester Aerial School of Photography, a war effort over at Kodak Park. And then the brand new armory down on East Main Street, the armory was opened as a convalescent hospital because
Oh, wow.
you either got sick and died very quickly from it, or you would get sick and then you could have a long convalescence of it. And it was very, I guess, grim and, morbid, but a way that the nurses would be able to tell is they'd walk up and down the beds in the wards, pull the sheets off of the patients. If their feet were purple, they knew that they were going to die, because as the influenza ravished the body turned off, let's say, all the peripherals, and it was just focusing in on keeping the vital organs working until the lungs filled up with fluid and blood, and they died.
So what would they do with the dead? I mean, did they have mass graves, or were they cremated? I mean, what was the disposal treatment?
Rochester was, I guess, for lack of better words, lucky that we didn't have to resort to mass graves. Although we did have a shortage of coffins, we had a prohibition against funerals. Funerals were only to be held with immediate families only. This was, remember, 1918. The common tradition was to have your funerals in your front parlor, in your house.
Right.
So that was frowned upon, because you're going to bring all these people and you're going to cram them in this tiny little room for someone that just died. So there's a very good chance that the family members of the deceased might be a carrier. So there was even a shortage of grave diggers at the time. So the dead did the process of burying the dead did back up, but they were trying to bury them as quickly as possible.
Let's say the major sections of, we have, I hate to use the dial, the economic activity, the religious activity, the public square activity. When did Rochester go, shut it all down? And who went first, and who fought against it?
Actually, Dr. Roby closed the schools. He closed the schools first on October 8th, and that was about a week after it was recognized and established that influenza had come to Rochester, and it was just like wildfire. The number of new cases was doubling, sometimes tripling in a 24-hour period. So the schools were closed first, but it was unique is that they brought the kids into school, and what they did was, the only thing they did that one day was they taught the kids how to take care of themselves, and if some family member got sick, basically to cover your mouth, sneeze into your elbow, wash your hands, keeping windows open when you're sleeping, getting a lot of fresh air. Those type of things. And then once those instructions were done, they sent the children home, and the schools were closed until the second week in November.
And how about the work environment? What were the major, did companies just shut down, or did they change it up and do trick shifts and spread out the workforce and the workday?
That's what happened is, because of the time period, we're in a war. There is no social safety net. You had to keep the workers working for a number of reasons. So factory shifts were staggered for reasons to try to eliminate, or at least minimize, the crowded streetcars. Because remember, 1918, cars were just for the rich people to play with. So everybody took the streetcars. So you wanted to stagger that. So there was really no closings. Some businesses were hurt worse than others. Just like today in COVID, the theater and entertainment businesses were closed first, because why? People gather there. But the factories themselves were not closed.
Okay. How about religious institutions?
That is very, very interesting, is that the Protestant churches, they closed first. But the Roman Catholic churches, the Roman Catholic diocese, at the time, there was really no authority over the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is powerful. It's been powerful for hundreds, 2,000 years.
A couple of thousand years.
Yeah, that's it. No problem. But what happened was Dr. Roby brought in Bishop Hickey and his staff, and what he did was he convinced the bishop that it was in the best interest for his flock if they were to close the churches and again close the parochial schools. But then at the same time, the bishop came out and made a statement that was in all the newspapers about how this was definitely a time for prayer, that you should continue to read the good book, that all the priests and nuns were praying for everyone, and that to continue. And this was going across all religions, all Christian and the Jewish religions, was that they should continue to practice their religion at home because they really thought it was going to be very, very helpful. And we found anytime that there's a crisis, people's faith helps them get through it.
Yeah.
Now, how did this affect the surrounding suburbs?
Well, the surrounding suburbs, as we know them, did not exist. The suburbs, I'm sitting in Webster right now, and in 1918, where I'm sitting was an apple orchard because Rochester, the surrounding areas fed the city. And what we did was we had an we exported food to other parts of the country. As a matter of fact, I like to brag about this because I'm born and bred in Webster, is that during the First World War, Webster, New York was the dried apple capital of the world.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, Rochester, like I said earlier, Rochester was a destination city. You came here because you could get a good job, and it didn't necessarily have to be in a factory. If you had a skill set working on farms, you could find a job in the Rochester area, no problem at all.
One of the things that I read was about how Mechanics Institutes had already started, and that was that like a precursor in the food service, like Food Link? Did that become basically the Food Link back at that time? Or is that more the Red Cross doing that?
Well, it was a little of both, because during the war, prior to the United States getting into the war, America was very involved in helping, especially the Belgians, because of the atrocities the Germans were accused of doing in Belgium. So we were sending a lot of food there. And as Napoleon very famously once said, an army marches on its stomach. So taught to do as a civilian population was to conserve food. This is the time where people made victory gardens in their backyard, so that there didn't have to be a lot of food being brought into the city, because you could grow your own fruit and vegetables. And this did two things. One is it freed up more food to be sent over to the troops. And two, it freed up more room on the trains to transport war materials for the war effort. So when we became involved in the war in April of 17, there were organizations that tried to get people to educate people on how to conserve food, how to cook food, how to dehydrate food and dry food, so that you can conserve it, so there wasn't as much waste. And this was very beneficial for all kinds of people, because especially the immigrants, they didn't have a lot of money, so they wanted their food money to stretch as far as possible.
One of the things that also came to mind is, how the media itself of the time. One of the things that struck me was that the Democrat and Chronicle, somebody would have a quarter page, correct me if I'm wrong, but a quarter page ad of this thing that could fight the influenza was chocolate malted milk or something like that.
No, the snake oil stuff. Like,
Can you go
idea?
into what was the media like, and in the beginning, middle, and end of that epidemic, and how they dealt with the issues at hand or not?
Well, just as railroads were the mass transportation of the time, newspapers were the mass communication of the time. So they carried good, bad, and indifferent news. And you have to remember is that they have to pay for the newspapers, so they took these ads. And there are unscrupulous people that will take advantage of people's fear during a crisis. So there was all kinds of these snake oil remedies about what to take so that you did not catch the influenza, and what to take once you got the influenza. People did make some money on it. The newspapers would print these folk remedies about taking cloves of garlic and wearing it around, wearing around your neck. Probably that was, probably to keep people away from you so they wouldn't sneeze on you. Yeah, the guy smells
That
like
one would
garlic.
work. That one would definitely work.
But I wanted milk.
So, yeah, I mean, it was a time that people, these savvy businessmen could make some money out of it, but it only lasted a very short time because the truth came through.
Now, was there a period of waves with this, or was it a prolonged effect that the community got sick and it kind of rose and then it kind of came down like a bell curve, or did we see a couple jumps?
Well, influenza as itself was in 3 waves. The first wave was in the spring and early summer of 1918. And it was absorbed, and there weren't a lot of massive deaths, and any deaths, it was absorbed, and it was really attributed to pneumonia. But then it kind of took a hiatus during the summer of 1918, and in the fall, it came back with a vengeance. That's when it attacked Rochester. And then by mid-November, influenza kind of left Rochester as quickly as it came into Rochester. And then in the spring of 1919, there again was the 3rd wave. But the 3rd wave wasn't as bad as the 2nd because we were prepared for it. We knew what to do. And Rochester really wasn't affected that drastically in the spring wave. Of course, people did get sick and die, and that, of course, every death is a tragedy. But it wasn't the, let's say, the newsworthiness of it. In fact, by the 2nd week in November, the papers stopped carrying stories about influenza.
Didn't Armistice Day have a lot of effect on how shall I say, the good news, bad news, and we want to make the bad news go away of what's happening locally, but also what was happening in the war, in the news there, and how sometimes that obviously did affect what the media chose to put in the paper and what area of the paper they put it in.
Yes, and that was something that was a challenge to me when I was doing the research. I sat and read newspapers for about 6 months, and there were 4 English newspapers during this time. And then what they would do is, of course, they're in business, they're competing with each other. So everyone was carrying lists of the hospitals and how many influenza patients were at each hospital, and then they started listing the names, ages, and addresses of the deaths for influenza. But what happened really was that by the end of, as it left the front, it was really never front page, because front page was always about the war. So the influenza, even in the local aspect of it, was always page 3 at the earliest. And usually I found them back at the end of the end of the first section. So by Armistice Day, November 11th, it was a unique day in Rochester because for the first time in 6 weeks, there was no death in Rochester that was attributed to influenza. And then by the 13th of November, the stories of influenza in the Rochester papers just kind of petered out.
Did people take preventative measures like wearing masks like people have been today or anything like that?
Yes, it was highly recommended that you wear gauze masks when you were out in public. And they even went so far as to say if you had a family member and you were taking care of them within your own home, that you wore the mask too, because they found out that it was airborne. They found that out very, very quickly at the beginning of it when it was leaving Fort Devens in Massachusetts. They realized it was airborne, so you wanted to protect your own airways. So gauze masks were highly recommended. Some occupations made their, like if you were a postman or if you ran one of the streetcars, you had to wear a mask. It was required, and people did it out of fear because this was so deadly. Children would go to school in the morning and come home in the afternoon and find their parents dead on the floor because of influenza. It could kill that quickly.
How is the police force? Obviously, it was a small number of people, but how did they respond? The public structure, whatever there was, how did they respond to the epidemic?
Well, they tried to help as much as they could in the enforcement of the suggestions that Dr. Roby made, such as closing things down, like closing the saloon. There were still people that were going to be just like today. You can't tell me what to do. This is my business. So there was appearance tickets written for people, but they didn't because it wasn't a law on the books. They didn't know what the penalty was going to be. And like you said earlier, they jumped on the streetcars and went to Brighton. Because Brighton was just at the four corners of East Avenue and Winton Road, and they didn't have the restrictions that the city did because as a city has a higher density of people, so therefore they had to have more restrictions than, let's say, Brighton or Webster.
What areas of the city would you say were mostly impacted, had the highest amount of death? Like the wards, using the ward system.
Well, it would be. I forgot what ward, but it would be where the up by the public market. When I did my research, I had a map of the city, and I was trying to put stick pins in where everybody died. Eventually, I couldn't fit any more into that neighborhood. And like we discussed earlier, that's where the last wave of immigrants. So that's going to be the highest density, let's say, per neighborhood. But influenza killed indiscriminately in Rochester. It didn't care how long you've been in Rochester, how much money you made. People were dying on East Avenue just as much as they were dying any place else. So, and your occupation had a lot to do with it too. 33% of all of the deaths were manual day laborers. They were the people that were out working in the public. So that just someone sick could walk by them and cough on them and they could be sick. But if you had a desk job, if you were a desk clerk was the occupation of the listing then, it was only 10%. It was only 10% of the deaths. So your occupation would definitely affect your vulnerability to influenza.
I think I saw artisans in there. There was some large number. Was it artists?
Well, they would be out in the public. If they were working out in the public, it really depended on your work environment. If you were out where people could cough on you, you're more likely to get sick than if you were in an office where you have your own desk. And a lot of it that we're doing today, it was learned during 1918, to wear the mask for this social distancing. Well, they didn't call it social distancing in 1918. They just said, stay away, because they were scared to death. Now what we've done is we have institutionalized this spacing so that you can't cough on someone. That 6 feet is the cough distance between two people. So
Most surprised you when you were doing this research?
that surprised me the most about it was the event itself. I knew that it was around. I was a history major. I got my master's in American history. I knew that it occurred, but I never knew it was so devastating, a disease to begin with, that it could kill so quickly, that it just didn't kill the old and the young, that it was, the curve was, instead of a U curve, meaning people on the early age and the older age are the ones that are going to die most. This was a W. So the people that were the ages of 18 to 40, actually, that was the demographics that was hurt the worst. And these are the young people that are in the prime of their life, especially the soldiers were being devastated by it, because we know this now because of all the research that was done after the fact. But these young people, their immune system was so vigorous, was so healthy, that when their immune system detected the unknown virus of influenza in their body, it viciously attacked its own self. So what would happen is the body would send all these fluids to try to expel the virus from the lungs, because if your lungs fill up with fluid, you cough, you try to get them out. Well, you were coughing so violently that the bronchioles were bursting. So now you were bleeding in your lungs. So now you were coughing up blood. So when they were doing autopsies, they would see these lungs that were just like soaked sponges filled with blood, and they had never seen this before. And that's why the young people were dying in such huge numbers, is their immune system was working too good.
What's the biggest thing that we can take away from the actions in the past that can help us today and in the future?
That it's people, that it's educated people that will make the difference, not only in the next epidemic, but every epidemic. We have to be educated. We have to know that we not only have to protect ourselves, but we have to protect others, because an epidemic does not see any type of divisions at all. Political, economic, social, nothing. It'll attack, it'll kill everybody and anybody. So we have to be educated. We have to work together so that we all can get out of this together.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on today and sharing this. This is an amazing piece to put together. We're going to get that up on the Facebook site, on our website. Any other links that you want us to know about?
Actually, if anyone is interested, my thesis is online for a free download. It's at Digital Commons. There you go. Digital Commons at brockport.edu. And I'm working on another small publication where I'm taking that. I'm my own worst enemy in this, because I have to edit all those 65,000 words down to about 7,000. So hopefully that'll be published in the near future too.
We look forward to that. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, I mean, just for me, it was actually inspiring. And also having been an AIDS activist, seeing the connection between how information, the value of information, how to prevent infection, and then if you are sick, how to get your treatment as best as we possibly can. So many things that I learned from this that it's helpful to today. So as I'm coughing, sorry, but I just really want to thank you for writing this, and thank you. I mean, you wrote this in 2010.
Correct. Yes.
Correct. So I want to thank you very much for being on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic interview, Christopher. Thank you for finding
I want to thank
piece
Gary
and then going out and finding him.
It's amazing the work that he put into this, and also just want to thank Gary Craig from the DNC. He put me onto his work, and thanks to the city of Rochester for letting him appear on our show.
Thank you.
As I stammer for my words, I was really taken aback. It's like, when you read somebody else's work and then You talked to them? I was nervous.
Were you really?
Yeah.
You were.
I remember everything I want to say because I don't like to pre-write questions. I know it sounds crazy.
You've been excited about this for months because you found
you have
this,
been.
and you were like, because you were researching different things that were similar to what has gone on today, and you found this treasure trove, and you've just been talking about. You read through the whole thing in a couple days, and then you've been telling everybody you meet all about this, which is just amazing and showed how excited that you really were.
And the fact that somebody would take to write about the history of Rochester at that time period and at a vulnerable period of time and treat it with such justice and I think the title too caught me. Rochester coughed, the 1918 influenza epidemic in Rochester. It didn't take a political slant that somebody else might call this pandemic or that pandemic, this flu or that flu, and that touched me. I just felt like I was being dropped right into that time period. And I look forward to his 7,000 word essay that he's writing up about this entire work that he did, and 6 months of reading newspapers. Oh my God! And I guess
Can
we're
you imagine spending that much time just going back and forth. Yeah.
I'm curious too to go back and look at this Dr. Roby what's his name?
Yeah.
That just knocked it out of the park, and he had quite a job to do, and just he has to be a fascinating character. And I looked him up a little bit. They call him the Dr. Fauci of the 1918.
That's awesome. I mean, that's cool.
Compare him to Dr.
The other thing he also points out, and for the readers to go through, I really recommend, one of the things I will tell people, if you go to this and you read it, you also find, obviously there were women who were at home who were taking care of their families at that time period, but the woman really rose to the occasion to save our city with regards to the Red Cross, with regards to nursing and to care and the families and to feed people. And this captures it. It captures so much of our history. There's, I found some things that were humorous, just, the drunks of Rochester getting onto the trolleys to Brighton, screw those laws of Rochester.
And it's really amazing that they had such a usable public transit system back then, because a lot of people just think, maybe it was horses and carriages and sidewalks, but they actually had the trolley cars that were operating. It allowed people to get to work and all that. And in also how he talked about the suburbs, that they really weren't existent, that they, were just farm fields. Because I do remember seeing photos from when my grandfather moved out to Greece, that Mount Reed Boulevard was all a dirt road. And you don't really think about that today because, a large population. We just call it Greater Rochester because we think of Rochester, you think of the whole of Monroe County, but it was really the city central. And it really was the first boom town there was. So it was this hub of economic activity, and that they had to keep it going to keep these people fed. It's a very fascinating subject what went on back then.
And it's also that we're not alone. That's the beautiful part of people that are able to write about history is that you're not alone, and that the things that people have gone through before maybe didn't figure it out as much quickly, but they certainly did things to actually save a city. So thank you very much,
Interesting too to see what might have come out of that the influenza back and then that we have today, like Food Link and things like that. Right. I'm sure had some connection to that back then. The thought that they had to keep everyone working because they had to feed their family. That's the only way they could feed them, is if they were working and got food and all that. And
one of the things about I remember reading was about the banks that they would open up later, and they were because they still had to sell war bonds. Because if they didn't sell the war bonds, the war effort would have suffered an economic.
Can you imagine
hardship.
Going through a pandemic and having a world war go on at the same time? I mean, we have no idea.
That blows me away.
We've seen skirmishes, like Gulf War, and all those other things, but we've never really been through that much pressure. I mean, you guys saw Vietnam and things like that, but World War I and World War II were a massive. That took on all the resources of every country that was involved, and it galvanized the nation as a whole to push on to this war effort. It's just amazing that they were able to do that and take care of this at the same time. But thank you again for bringing that up to us. But you know what we have done, Brian?
We have done hour number 1.
Whoa!
We're going to go to hour number 2 Wow, 2 hours of fun. And you're listening to the Rainbow Rock Show on WAYOLP Rochester. Rochester. Rochester.